Hi guys, for today's lesson we're going to be dealing with simplifying ratios today. So last lesson we got introduced to these ratios, now we need to be able to simplify them, make the numbers as small as possible. So ratios are easy to solve problems with when they are in simplified form, i.e. the numbers are whole numbers. It's really important that they're only whole, we don't want to deal with fractions or decimals. And the whole numbers are as small as possible. Obviously, smaller numbers are easy to work with, easy to manipulate. So we need to be able to make a complicated ratio with really big numbers or with fractions or decimals turn into a ratio that is as simple as possible. So you need to remember that you need to divide both sides of the ratio by the same number, a common factor to simplify. So you have to think to yourself, what number is a common factor to both parts of your ratio? That means a number that fits into both numbers of your ratio. Really similar to fractions. You have to think what fit into both numerator and denominator. It's similar with ratios. So for example, if I've got 36 to 24, that ratio is not in simplest form, those numbers are relatively big. I can make those numbers smaller by dividing them both by the same number. So I can see that they're both even, I can divide both of them by 2, I can halve both of them. So that becomes the same as 18 to 12. That can go even smaller if I want. I can divide them both by 2 as well. That gets to 9 to 6. And then 9 to 6 can go even smaller. You can think to yourself, hang on, 3 fits into both 9 and 6. So I can divide both of them by 3. And I get my simplest ratio, 3 to 2. Nothing except for 1 fits into both 3 and 2. And if you divide by 1, it won't change it. So it'll just stay like this. So that is what we call the simplest form of this ratio here. We'd much prefer to work with 3 to 2 rather than 36 to 24. Note, dividing both sides by the highest common factor, so the highest factor that's possible between these two numbers, that will fully simplify the ratio instantly. So if I looked at my 36 to 24 and I thought, what is the highest common factor? 2 is probably the lowest common factor, except for 1. But if I decided to divide both of these by 12, which is the highest common factor of 36 and 24, that would go straight from this all the way to this straight away. So it's a helpful tool to think about what the highest common factor is. Because if you don't use the highest one, you've got to keep simplifying, like it won't simplify straight away. Okay, so some example questions. So simplify the following ratio. So this is our first ratio. This ratio has 3 parts to it. You have to think to yourself, what is the highest common factor of 15, 25 and 70? Well, first up, I think to myself, well, 15 and 25, 5 fits into both of those numbers, and 5 also fits into 70. So I'm thinking 5. I may be wrong, but we can look at our answer that we get to see if we are wrong there. So if I divide each of my 3 parts of my ratio by the same number, remember it has to be the same number with ratios, I get 3 to 5 to 14. And try to check your answer. Is there any number that fits into both 3, 5 and 14, except for 1, obviously. And there isn't, so that's going to be your simplest form. You are done. Next one, we're dealing with fractions now. How do we, there's a bit of a problem with fractions. So let's deal with this strategy here. So the strategy when you see fractions in a ratio, how do we simplify that? You want to convert mixed numerals to improper fractions first. We don't want to deal with mixed numerals. And then you want to multiply both sides by the denominators to convert them to whole numbers. So a really important strategy there. I don't want you to forget it. Okay, so let's give it a try. So first up, our mixed numeral here, 2 1/4, has to change to its improper fraction form. That's the first step. And now that you're dealing with no mixed numerals, you want to multiply by these denominators. So let's multiply by 4 both sides first. So timesing by 4 on both sides, that's the first thing you need to do. What you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So 9/4 times 4, that actually gives you 9. The idea is that these 4s here are going to cancel out and leave you just the top number. If you put that into a calculator, it'll give you 9. Notice how we go from a fraction, like the reason we do this is to go from this fraction to something that's not a fraction. We want to get rid of fractions pretty much. I still have to do this to the other side. That gives me 12/5. You can use a calculator for that if you wish. But a simple way to do it is just to do top times this number. That gives you your 12, and the bottom won't change in this case. Next up, we've got to get rid of this denominator. So we're going to times both sides by that 5. So 9 times 5 gives you 45. It's still a whole number, that's fine. And here, these 5s are going to cancel, leaving you with just the 12. And we're then dealing with this ratio here, 45 to 12. Now, that's still not in simplest form. We've got to make these numbers as small as possible. We can divide them both by 3, which fits into both. That's the highest common factor of these two numbers. 45 divided by 3 is 15, and 12 divided by 3 is 4. Now check this answer, 15 to 4. So there's literally nothing that goes into both 15 and 4 except for 1, so therefore we are done. Okay, moving on. Let's try this one with decimals. So again, we've got a different strategy when we're dealing with decimals in a ratio. So you want to multiply both sides by 10 or 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 or 1,000,000, etc. We want to remove the decimals from both numbers. Okay, so I look at this number here and I see 1.25. I want to try and get this decimal to go to the end of the decimal of the number, so it becomes a whole number. So it needs like 2 jumps. It needs to be multiplied by 100, 2 jumps. And what you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So 1.25 times 100, that comes out as 125. That's a whole number. It's all about making whole numbers. And then 0.8 times 100, that gives me 80. So that's that number there is the smallest number possible that will make both of these turn into whole numbers. So we get out these two whole numbers. Now we need to think what's the highest common factor of these two whole numbers. And then and the highest common factor of these two is 5. So we can divide both by our highest common factor. 125 divided by 5 is 25, and 80 divided by 5 is 16. Then you have to think to yourself, is there any numbers that now go into this? And there is nothing other than 1 that goes into 25 and 16. So that is as simple as it's going to get. Hope this helps with the questions. Bye.